This and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Become a patron today and help support the show while getting exclusive content made just for you. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome here to the 2022 Gettysburg National Military Park Winter Lecture Series. My name is Dan Vermilya. I'm a Park Ranger at the Eisenhower National Historic Site, formerly of Gettysburg National Military Park. And for me, getting to participate in these every year and see so many familiar faces, this is always one of my favorite parts of the year here in Gettysburg. It's a great way to kick off a new calendar year. It's a great way to explore some new topics and dive into some of the many angles here that make this such a rich place in American history. I do want to thank you all for being here and for your attendance today and for supporting the park. I do want to remind you all that tomorrow, my good friend and colleague John Hoptack will be presenting his winter lecture, I believe, on Fantasyland. So come on out and explore that. And if you can't come, just remember that we are live streaming these on the Gettysburg National Military Park YouTube channel. I do also want to thank everybody for masking up today and maintaining social distancing. We very much appreciate that and your cooperation and participation with that, as that allows us to keep presenting these programs live and in person. Our topic today is one that I am very interested in and very excited about. I think it's a fascinating topic that gets to what makes Adams County, Pennsylvania, such a fascinating place for history buffs, for historians, for those who are interested in the American story. This is a town here in Gettysburg that has so many interwoven layers of history. And Gettysburg National Military Park, Gettysburg National Cemetery, and the Eisenhower National Historic Site are all part of that. We're all interwoven together in many, many different ways. And I think that Dwight Eisenhower choosing Gettysburg to be the only place that he and Mamie would own a home together is a very, very significant thing. And that one kind of gets into what I want to focus on here in our program today. What makes a place home? Home is one of these words that we use every single day. We use it throughout our lives. But do we ever pause and think about what it really means to us? What makes a place home? It could be many, many different things. For Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower, they actually had many homes in their lives together. But their Gettysburg farm, right next to the Gettysburg battlefield, was the only place they actually owned together, the only place they really, truly called home during their many years together. But home can be many different things. A home can be where we were born, such as for Dwight Eisenhower in Denison, Texas. A home can be where we grew up. For Dwight Eisenhower, that would be Abilene, Kansas. Here is his boyhood home. That is where the Eisenhower Presidential Library is located. And that is where Dwight and Mamie and their firstborn, their little boy, Icky, are all buried. Home could be where we went to school. For Dwight Eisenhower, that would be West Point, of course. Home could be where we met that special someone. This photograph is the officers' quarters at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. That was Eisenhower's first posting after he left West Point. And in the autumn of 1915, that's where he met Mamie Geneva Dowd. It's also where he, coincidentally enough, was stationed on December 7th of 1941 when he received the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the news that would change his life. Home can also be where we work. One of the many places where Eisenhower worked was right here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in 1918 when he was assigned to Camp Colt on the Gettysburg battlefield, the World War I tank training camp here on the grounds of Gettysburg National Military Park. Home can also be where we live. And for the Eisenhowers, again, they're living all over the place. They're living in the White House. It can be wherever we have that special someone, wherever we feel most ourselves, a part of our life that is central to understanding who we are. And again, for the Eisenhowers, there are many of these places. This image here, it's known as the Eisenhower Toile. It was designed by Elizabeth Draper right after the Eisenhowers were elected, after Eisenhower was elected and after they went into the White House. And it shows the many different places where they lived together in the fabric of it. We have it on display in a few parts of the Eisenhower home, most specifically the curtains in the sitting room of the Eisenhower home are made out of this fabric. But I want all of you to take a moment and think about what makes a place home for you. Think about home, that word home. What's the first place that comes to mind? And then ask yourself, what makes that my home? And then a follow-up question, how has that place shaped me? How has that place shaped the course of my life? How has that influenced who I became and what I did? Eisenhower understood this very well because he was on the move for so much of his life. He understood the importance of home because he lived in so many of them. And there are few things, along with this concept of home, that are more meaningful than the idea of a homecoming, getting to return back to your home after having been away for it for a long time. That is something else that Eisenhower was keenly aware of, because he himself got to have a pretty magnificent homecoming in 1945, in June of 1945. The war, of course, is still going on at that time. War is still being waged against the Japanese in the Pacific. But for Dwight Eisenhower in June of 1945, he has overseen victory in Europe. He comes back to the United States, not before giving a major address at the Guildhall in London on June 12th. He goes to Washington. He's involved in parades. President Truman pins a medal on him. And then on June 22nd, he gets to go to Abilene, Kansas, the place where he grew up, the place where he would eventually be buried. And in his remarks that day, he says, because no man is really a man who has lost out of himself all of the boy. I want to speak first of the dreams of a barefoot boy. And he goes on to note that in those dreams, there was always that day when that boy when he comes home to a welcome from his own hometown. Because today, that dream of mine, 45 years or more ago, has been realized beyond the wildest stretches of my own imagination. I come here first to thank you, to say the proudest thing I can claim is to say I am from Abilene. And Ike was keenly aware of this importance of homecoming because he had just overseen some of the grandest and costliest campaigns in military history. And he was keenly aware that the only reason he was getting this homecoming, the only reason he was being celebrated, was because of those whom he had commanded, many of whom had given their lives in the pursuit of what Eisenhower termed the Great Crusade. He even said as much at Abilene, noting, my position was merely a symbol of the forces over there, and you people put on a special thing to say to those soldiers, thank you. 10 days earlier, when he was speaking in London in his Guildhall address, he said, I come from the very heart of America. And he also espoused on this idea of who is really to thank for the victory in Europe. Eisenhower said in London, humility must always be the portion of any man who received acclaim earned in the blood of his followers and the sacrifices of his friends. Conceivably, a commander may have been professionally superior. He may have given everything of his heart and mind to meet the spiritual and physical needs of his comrades. He may have written a chapter that will glow forever in the pages of military history. Still, even such a man, if he existed, would sadly face the fact that his honors cannot hide in his memories the crosses marking the resting places of the dead. They cannot soothe the anguish of the widow or the orphan whose husband or whose father will not return. In his entire career, Eisenhower was never a combat commander. He never personally led men into combat, but he was keenly aware and understood the significance of others making these sacrifices. The weight of these casualties, and you can see here with his Distinguished Service Medal being awarded by President Truman, the weight of these casualties, he realized that because these men who had fallen under his command, they rested all over the world. Tunisia, North Africa, where Eisenhower got his first experience leading Allied forces in World War II. The island of Sicily in the Mediterranean. Perhaps his most famous campaign, Normandy, Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion in June of 1944. His costliest battle, the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, where many of the fallen are now buried at the Henri Chapelle United States Military Cemetery, still in Belgium. And yes, some of those who are buried here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Our program today is about the meaning and importance of home, and specifically we're examining it through the lens of the native sons of Adams County who fought and died in World War II. This was a county that saw great bloodshed and sacrifice throughout its history. In 1863, it saw the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. During World War II, Adams County was very much impacted. There was Camp Sharp, the psychological warfare training camp. There was a German prisoner of war camp. There were military groups doing staff rides on the battlefield. There were even talk of scrap metal drives that would impact the monuments on the battlefield. But the biggest way that Gettysburg and Adams County were impacted by the Second World War was the same way that every other American county was impacted by the Second World War, and that its sons and daughters who grew up here were part of the millions, the some 16 million Americans who served in uniform during the Second World War. Ordinary towns like Gettysburg here in Adams County won the war for freedom in the 1860s, and they won the war for freedom again in the 1940s. It represents every town, Gettysburg represents every town and county across the United States that sent its native sons to fight on foreign seas and continents. And those who we're going to talk about today, some of them were born here in Adams County. Some were born elsewhere and moved here. Perhaps they moved here for their college education. Or they moved here because they met a girl who was from Adams County and they fell in love. Or they moved here for work. Whatever it was, they called Adams County home at various points in their lives, and they were all tied together. They called Adams County home just like Ike and Mamie did. Ike and Mamie would one day live alongside some of these individuals, their widows, their orphans, their parents. They would know them. They knew the same streets and churches. Some of them went to the same church that the Eisenhowers went to. Now, just some rough idea of what Adams County contributed in uniform during the World Wars. In World War I, and we're looking at the 1920 census for the clearest gauge of population here, there were 34,583 citizens in Adams County. Just over 1,000 of them served in uniform, 53 killed or died in service. During World War II, the population was just shy of 40,000. Over 6,000 served in uniform, 6,671 specifically, and 122 were killed or died during service in the Second World War. So these are some of the stories we're going to be talking about here this afternoon in our program. Specifically, we're going to hear the stories of 18 of these individuals, at least 18 of these individuals who died in World War II, and we're specifically going to focus on those who were buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. These individuals who hailed from Adams County and then were ultimately calling Adams County their final resting place. And it's certainly not lost on me that they're from this town, they were shaped by this town, and they're also shaped by the history of this town. They grew up in the same place, so they lived in the same place where Abraham Lincoln had in 1863 stood and reminded Americans that there was still a great task remaining before us. And then some of these individuals went on to give their lives in what General Eisenhower termed the Great Crusade, which was still pursuing some of those same central themes and ideas that Lincoln outlined and Lincoln had as a part of that great task remaining before us. So how was it that these individuals came to be buried here in Gettysburg National Cemetery? The question of the repatriation of the dead is not our entire focus here today. It's mostly on the stories themselves, but it bears mention. The question is an important one. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States embarked on a really unprecedented effort in size and scale. Certainly it had been done before. The groundwork for returning dead from overseas battles and campaigns had been laid after World War I, where the United States government gave family members, next of kin, the choice of where they wanted their loved one to be buried, and thousands were ultimately brought home. In World War II, after World War II, of the 280,000 American servicemen who were identified, who died overseas during the war, ultimately 171,000 of them were brought home for final burial in the United States. Whether this was final burial in a private cemetery or a final burial in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. More than 60% of the worldwide dead were brought home, and the government paid for it all at the cost of $564.50 per body. Think about that for just a moment. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Rick Atkinson wrote, this was quote, an unprecedented repatriation that only an affluent, victorious nation could afford. And I think it says something very profound about the United States and what it fought for during World War II that this was done. This image here is of the USS Joseph V. Connolly in October of 1947, leaving the port of Antwerp, bringing the first group of fallen U.S. servicemen home from Europe. Some of those on this ship in this photograph were buried here in Gettysburg National Cemetery. And what about Gettysburg? Well, this was one of just 2 cemeteries in the state of Pennsylvania that were accepting the repatriation of these World War II dead in the years immediately after World War II. It was a cemetery that was still open. It had seen some burials from the Spanish-American War. It had seen burials from World War I. And the initial round of questionnaires that was sent out asking loved ones where they wanted their next of kin buried, the initial batch sent out was 27,000. And of those, 288 requests came back selecting Gettysburg as their burial choice, which caught the National Park Service off guard. The National Park Service said, wow, that number is very high. The quote from the Gettysburg Times was, National Park Service officials believe it is because of Gettysburg's importance as a national shrine that so many next of kin of World War II dead have requested burial here. Ultimately, it was decided, how many are we going to accommodate here? How many new burial spots are we going to have? They ultimately capped it at just under 600. There would be 590 World War II fallen brought here and buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery from 1947 through the spring of 1950. And these dead, they're from all theaters of the war, all corners of the war. Some fell in training accidents stateside. We're going to, again, focus just specifically on the stories of some of those who were from Adams County specifically. These individuals who called this county home, again, whether they were born here, or they moved here, or they worked here, or they went to school here, something about this county resonated with them, became their home, and became a vital, important part of their story. And these 18 from Adams County who were buried here, who we're going to talk about, they're in 3 categories. We'll split them up for the purposes of organization here today. Stateside casualties, casualties from the Pacific, and, of course, casualties from the European theater of operations. So first we'll talk about those who are stateside casualties of war. And when I say stateside casualties of war, what do I mean? I mean, these are individuals who are dying in training accidents in the United States during World War II. It did happen. And this is an image of the cemetery in 1944, specifically Section 1, where some of these initial stateside casualties are being interred, along with veterans of World War I and other veterans who are perishing and passing away during the Second World War. Our first individual who we will meet is Sergeant Dorsey Decker. Dorsey was the son of Joseph Albert and Olive Decker. He was a sergeant who served in the 450th Training Squadron of the Army Air Corps. And he was not born here. He was born in Blair County, Pennsylvania, in January of 1919. After his parents divorced, his mother remarried, and it appears that it was at that point that the family moved here, as there were several notices in the Gettysburg Times in 1937 that young Dorsey was looking for work. He stood 5'7" tall, weighed 158 pounds. He had blue eyes, brown hair, and a light complexion. And he joined up in 1942. In the 450th Specialized Pilot Training Squadron, Dorsey was nicknamed Buddy, and he had multiple cross-country flights on his resume prior to January of 1944, when he was killed in a plane crash, when his bomber he was flying crashed just outside of outside of Fort Worth, Texas. He was flying from Hendricks Field, Florida, to Fort Worth, Texas. The plane crashed and he was killed. Several days later, his remains were brought back here to Gettysburg, and he was interred in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. One of his comrades came with him. Sergeant Gilbert Help accompanied Dorsey's body home, and he paid tribute to Dorsey, noting, "He was a fine soldier, a mighty good engineer specialist, and an enthusiastic member of the Air Forces. I knew Sergeant Decker a long time. He was well liked by the men, an excellent worker, and was very particular about his ship. He was always a hustler and took pride in his work. He was always doing something to keep his ship in good condition and fine appearance. Dorsey was buried here in Gettysburg in Section 1 of the National Cemetery on January 21st of 1944. The following year, tragedy would again strike the Decker family when Dorsey's brother Harold was killed in action during the Battle of the Bulge on Christmas Day, leading the Gettysburg Times to note in January of 1945 of their mother, Olive, quote, "This is the first instance of known record that an Adams County mother has lost 2 sons in this war." Our next stateside casualty who we will meet is Harold Kinsey, who went to Gettysburg High School. He was born in Reading, Pennsylvania. In 1924, his parents were Paul and Ruth Kinsey, but in 1938, the family moved to Gettysburg, where Paul worked as a superintendent of the Metropolitan Edison Electric Company. Paul was very active in high school. The Gettysburg Times pages are full of references to Harold participating in multiple plays and athletic events. Harold was 6'4", so he played basketball, and he was quite good. He was part of championship basketball teams in the early 1940s. He was also a member of the Christ Lutheran Church and Troop 80 of the Boy Scouts. He joined up in 1942 in the month of December, and he was training stateside, becoming a pilot. He trained at Maxwell Field in Alabama, then in Florida, then in Georgia, and he got his pilot's wings in April of 1944. Harold was killed in a plane crash in 1945, January of 1945, when his plane crashed near Panama City, Florida. The family chose to have him buried here in Gettysburg, and they chose to provide their own headstone, which was allowed. Harold was buried here on February 3rd of 1945. Among the pallbearers at his funeral was Dr. Frederick Tilburg, the chief historian of Gettysburg National Military Park at the time. There aren't nearly as many of these stateside casualties buried here, but certainly Dorsey and Harold remind us that this war was being waged overseas, but there was still a cost happening at home as well. Our next category we will look at, the Pacific Theater, those casualties from the Pacific Theater of World War II, where there were over 111,000 American combat deaths, including over 31,000 naval officers and enlisted men during the Second World War. This photograph here is an American cemetery on Guadalcanal. The first of these who we will meet is Lawrence Woodward, who was a Gettysburg native. Born here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on September 17th of 1923. His parents were Clarence and Jeanette Woodward. His father worked as a plumber, and growing up, Lawrence was nicknamed Woody. He also went to Gettysburg High School, was in the drama club, the sportsman's club, the chess club. After high school, he moved to Norwood, Pennsylvania, and worked for a local railroad. He was married. He married a girl named Margaret in July of 1943, and he was drafted into service that same year. Lawrence stood 5'11" tall, weighed 160 pounds, had blue eyes, blonde hair, and a light complexion. And he would serve as a private first class in Company B of the 164th Infantry Regiment, 23rd Infantry Division. By early 1945, Lawrence was fighting in the Philippines, and it was in February that Private First Class Woodward was mortally wounded on the island of Leyte, hit by Japanese fire. He suffered a broken right arm, wounds to his right side and stomach, and multiple shrapnel injuries. He died of those wounds on April 15th of 1945 at the age of 22. He was brought back here and ultimately buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery on July 21st of 1949. Our next World War II casualty from Adams County we will meet is Eretus Worthington. Unfortunately, I do not have a photograph of Eretus. He's one of the few we do not have a photograph of for our program today. But he was also serving in the Philippines, and he became a casualty of war. He drowned at Luzon in the Philippines. He died in April of 1945, just before Lawrence passed away from his wounds. Eretus is buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery side by side with his wife, Helen. They are buried in Section 3 along with Lawrence Woodward. Section 3 is the part of the National Cemetery behind the Lincoln Speech Memorial. Lieutenant Junior Grade Delbert Gideon. He is from all over the place. He was born in Indiana, he was raised in Oklahoma, and he lived in Gettysburg for a while. His father was from Virginia, and his mother was from Indiana. So he's kind of a classic American story. He's from all over the place. He went to high school in Oklahoma, was in the Boys Glee Club there, attended the University of Oklahoma, and he joined the United States Navy in 1927. So he had a long naval career before the Second World War even started. His wife, Sarah Catherine Black, was a native of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. She was in the Women's Reserve of the United States Navy and was discharged in 1943, right around the time the couple was trying to have a child. It was the following year, July 31st, 1944, that Delbert Gideon was on a flight in the Pacific, and his plane crashed and he was killed near the coast of Australia. He was on a flight that was basically going from island to island in the Pacific on a tour of duty. He was with a Rear Admiral, Charles P. Cecil, who he is actually buried in Arlington National Cemetery. But they were killed in this plane crash in the Pacific. Cecil was the 9th flag officer lost by the Navy during World War II. At the time that Delbert was killed, he and his wife did have a young son who was 8 months old, George William Gideon. And the couple lived at 401 Baltimore Street in the town of Gettysburg, which is the address that many of us today know as the Farnsworth House. Delbert was ultimately brought back here and buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery on November 1st of 1947. I should note that his wife, Sarah, and his son, George, after their passing, they are buried in the Evergreen Cemetery. So they are all together on Cemetery Hill. Our next story is one of the many African Americans who are buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Starrett Addison Dorsey, a native of Gettysburg, born here in March 31st of 1926. He was in the Gettysburg High School class of 1946, but he left after his sophomore year to enlist, figuring that at some point he might get drafted and he wanted to enlist first. He was a standout football player here in Gettysburg, and he was, from many accounts, beloved by his classmates, very, very popular. One of his classmates noted, quote, "He was a very pleasant and unassuming young man. He was a very nice person, and for all his athletic ability, he was very modest about it. His nickname was Duke. His family lived on Breckenridge Street in the town of Gettysburg." Well, Starrett enlisted in the U.S. Navy in June of 1944. And he was assigned and served on the USS Bridge. And his death was not as in a combat casualty. He was killed in an accident aboard the bridge from a head injury in December of 1945, just after the war had ended. But he was just off the coast of Japan. The bridge was just off the coast of Japan at the time this accident occurred. And Starrett was ultimately brought home for final burial to the Gettysburg National Cemetery, where he was interred in January 7th of 1948. Our next two stories, sadly, I don't have a lot of information on these just yet. There were 64 alums of Gettysburg College who died during World War II. 3 of them are buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. 2 of them are just one grave apart in Section 2, Row 7, and that is Lieutenant Robert Love and Captain James Thompson. Captain James Thompson was killed in a plane crash when he was flying near the Himalaya Mountains in India. He had just been promoted, been given command of a post there. His duty prior to that had been flying the hump, flying over those mountains in the Himalayas, a very dangerous duty. But he was killed by a plane crash in November of 1944. And just, again, 2 graves down from him, Lieutenant Robert Love, also a student from Gettysburg College. He was killed in a plane crash in Australia, just off the coast of Australia in May of 1942. James was a native of North Belle Vernon, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. He had graduated Gettysburg College in 1940, where he was a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity at Gettysburg. Robert Love, he was a native of Chester County, Pennsylvania. And when his plane crashed, his squadron had been flying from Australia, and they encountered some bad weather. They tried to turn back and refuel. He was trying to make a landing on a beach, and his plane simply could not make the landing, and he was killed upon impact. These servicemen were brought home and buried in Gettysburg on the same day, June 6th of 1948. As the European theater of World War II was the costliest theater for American forces, it is of no surprise that most of these Adams County natives who were killed during the war were killed serving in the European theater of operations. These were men who called Dwight Eisenhower their commanding officer at one point in time, and of course Eisenhower would one day live amongst the same places that they knew well in life. In the European theater, just in the final 11 months alone in Western Europe, Americans lost 587,000 casualties. It was 78% of Allied losses in the European theater during that time span. 135,576 American dead just in Western Europe alone. The first of these we will meet is Orbee Macmillion. He was also born elsewhere. He was born in West Virginia, but his family moved to Gettysburg in the 1930s, and Orbee lived here for 13 years before his death. He was married. His wife was named Korean Sprankle. They were married in 1938 in Westminster, Maryland. Orbee worked in a furniture factory here in town, and Korean operated a sewing machine in a silk mill. When Orbee registered for selective service, he was 27 years old, stood 5'8". He weighed 114 pounds, had blue eyes, brown hair, and a ruddy complexion. He entered into service in May of 1943, and he served in Company F of the 273rd Infantry Regiment. By the time he was sent overseas, he was in the 179th Infantry in the 45th Division. He arrived in North Africa in October 1943, and by early 1944, he was serving in Italy, taking part in the Anzio campaign. His last letter home was dated February 5th, and just some 2 weeks later, he was fatally wounded fighting outside of Anzio. In a telegram received on April 11th of 1944, his family was told that Orbee was missing in action. Finally, in July, several months later, word arrived that he had indeed been killed. His wife was living in Gettysburg at the address 406 South Washington Street at the time. Orbee was brought back here for final burial July 23rd of 1948. Korean, she lived all the way until 1996, and after her passing, she was buried side by side with Orbee in the Gettysburg National Cemetery, also in Section 3. Next up is Maurice Small, the eldest of 17 children born to Augustus and Ada Grace Small. His father, Walter Augustus, worked as a pressman and a printer for the Gettysburg Times, so growing up, guess what Maurice did? He delivered papers. He was a graduate of St. Francis Xavier's parochial school. He was married. His wife was named Martha Emma Miller. They were married in 1936, and they had no children. When he registered for selective service, Maurice was 5'6". He weighed 125 pounds, had blue eyes, brown hair, and a light complexion. And he was drafted in November of 1943, and he went to training at Fort McClellan in Alabama. And he was sent overseas in the summer of 1944, assigned to Company C of the 116th Infantry Regiment, which just weeks before had been one of the first American regiments to hit the shores of Omaha Beach on D-Day. And shortly after arriving in France, Maurice was killed on July 13th of 1944 outside of St. Lo during the Normandy campaign. One of his last letters home to his father said, "In the event something should happen to me, please see that Tub and Chet, two of his younger brothers, both get a good education. And if Mart, his wife Martha, should need anything, please give her a helping hand." Well, Maurice was ultimately brought back home here for final burial in 1948. His younger brother, Chester, was 15 when he learned of Maurice's death. And he would later say this: "Maurice was 38 years old when he was killed. Most men in the military were young, 19, 20, 21 years old. Maurice was married. He was promised when he went into training that he would not go overseas. He went on to note his wife never accepted that he was dead. But 2 of my brothers visited his grave in France at different times. This would, of course, been before Maurice was brought home. Chester himself would join the Marines in 1945 at the age of 16. He passed away in 2010, but he was very involved in the community before his passing. He was a founder of a place many of you are familiar with, the Horse Soldier in town. Next up is the third of our Gettysburg College alums who gave their lives during the Second World War and were buried in Gettysburg National Cemetery. Ralph Logan Staley, an exceptional young man. He was born in Altoona, Pennsylvania in April of 1922. He was a pillar of his community, a member of his local Lutheran church. He was raised in the midst of the Great Depression with hardships. His father, Jacob, passed away in 1936. After graduating high school at the age of 16, he began his undergraduate education at Gettysburg College in 1938. And there he served as an editor for the campus newspaper and yearbook. He was a member of the Student Senate, the men's varsity debate team. He was an excellent student academically. He was in National Honor Societies for journalism, German, education, and history. So this is a standout student and an exceptional young man. And being an avid student of history, it is no doubt very likely that he spent much time on the battlefield, even perhaps walking through the pathways of Gettysburg National Cemetery. After his graduation in January of 1943, he joined up, went to officer training school. By April of 1944, he was an officer, a second lieutenant serving in the 30th Infantry Division, the 119th Infantry Regiment. He arrived in France shortly after D-Day, and on August of 1944, he was killed in action outside of Mortain at the age of 22. His last letter home arrived on August 18th of 1944. And any worries his mother may have had about a lapse in communication were assuaged on August 25th when she got a bouquet of flowers from Ralph. They arrived 4 days after he was killed. He had arranged for them to be sent before his death. They arrived for her birthday. She was told, Florence Staley was told of her only child's death by Western Union telegram on September 11th, 1944. His mother, of course, chose to have Ralph brought back to the soil of his native state here in Pennsylvania. When he was buried in Gettysburg National Cemetery in April of 1949, services were led by the Reverend Dr. Henry Hansen, the president of Gettysburg College. And the pallbearers were all classmates of his from Gettysburg. Private First Class Robert Staub served in the 318th Infantry, 80th Infantry Division. He was born in Adams County, a native of Hanover, or just outside of Hanover, born February 19th of 1920. His father was Ellis Eugene Staub, and his mother was Louise Rebecca. Ellis was a woodworker at a cabinet factory, and he was a World War I veteran who was wounded at Chateau Thierry on the Western Front in July of 1918. He served as a private in Company D of the 7th U.S. Infantry, 3rd Infantry Division. And Robert was their eldest child out of 5 children born to the couple. So the son of a World War I veteran who had fought in France in 1918 to make the world safe for democracy, who would end up fighting in France himself many years later. When Robert enlisted, he was 138 pounds, had brown eyes, brown hair, and a light complexion. He enlisted in July of 1942 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. By July 1944, he was overseas, first in England, and then on to France, where again he served in the 80th Infantry Division. He was killed in action November 16th of 1944. His family chose to have Robert brought back home for his final burial in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. He was interred here June 29th of 1949. 20 years after Robert's death in combat, his father, Ellis, the World War I veteran, he passed away. And he, too, is buried in Gettysburg National Cemetery, several sections away. Again, the father fought in France in 1918 to make the world safe for democracy, and his son fought in France in 1944, giving his life. Today they are buried Not in the same quite section, but still they're buried in the same national cemetery here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Willard or Bob Creighton. He was a tech sergeant in the 79th Infantry Division, born August 5th of 1910. He was born just outside of Hanover in Adams County, but the family lived in Carroll County, Maryland. According to the 1920 census, his father was a farmer. By 1930, Willard was 19, still living with his parents and working in a shoe factory. He would soon move to Littlestown, where he was married. His wife worked in the same shoe company that he did. She was an office manager there. When Willard, or Bob as he was known, when he joined up, he was 5'9", weighed 155 pounds, had gray eye, brown hair, and a ruddy complexion. I do want to pause and say there's a reason why I'm telling you what color eyes these guys had and what color hair they had, because I think it's significant. I think it matters. I think it helps these black and white photographs, or when we don't have the photographs, I think it helps their stories to be more easily seen by us today. He was drafted into the Army in December of 1943, was sent overseas the following year. He arrived overseas in June of 1944. In November of 1944, he was wounded in the shoulder by an artillery shell fragment. He was awarded the Purple Heart, but he went back into combat. And in December 16th, 1944, Bob Creighton was killed in action near the Siegfried Light in eastern France. And he was ultimately brought home for final burial here, January 26th of 1949. Another casualty who fell in December of 1944 was Earl Swope. I want to pause and thank here some of the Swope family members for allowing us to use some photographs of Earl here for talking about him here today. Earl was born in Gettysburg in March of 1922. He went to Gettysburg High School. His nickname was Beck. His wife was known as Polly. Here you can see Earl climbing a tree and a photograph of Polly as well. They were married in July of 1942, and several months later, Earl enlisted in the U.S. U.S. Army. He was 20 years old. He would serve in the 99th Infantry Division, Company C of the 393rd Infantry Regiment. When they were overseas in Europe in December of 1944, the 393rd Infantry Regiment was in the Ardennes Forest in mid-December on the front lines of what would be the biggest and bloodiest battle of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, where 1 out of every 10 American casualties from that war fell during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, the opening day, Earl's regiment had a front row view to the German attack, and he was killed in the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge. It's a photograph taken by a good friend and fine Ranger Philip Brown, who was visiting the Ardennes Forest. These are the woods where Earl was killed when he was serving in the Battle of the Bulge. It's a copy of Earl's Purple Heart certificate, again, courtesy of some of his surviving family members. Earl Swope was initially buried at the Henri Chapelle Cemetery in Belgium, but in 1948, at the request of his family, his remains were brought home to the United States for final burial, where he was laid to rest here in Gettysburg on April 21st of 1948 in Section 3 of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Sergeant Hobart Sterner, a native of Littlestown, Pennsylvania. His parents were Willis and Pauline Sterner. His mother died in 1925 when Hobart was 4. He lived with his father for a while, lived with his grandfather for a while, was married. In July of 1942, he married a girl named Frances in Silver Run, Maryland, and the couple lived in Gettysburg on Baltimore Street. He worked for several local companies, worked on several local farms, and after he enlisted, he was sent overseas. He became a staff sergeant in the 395th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division. So the same division that Earl Swope served in, just a different regiment. And Hobart was killed in action 5 miles outside of Cologne, Germany, on March 2nd of 1945. The telegram the War Department sent home read, "You have the deepest sympathy of all the officers and enlisted men of his company in your bereavement. Hobart was held in high regard by all those who knew him. He was a splendid soldier and a man in whom you have a right to be extremely proud. his loss will be deeply felt by many friends. While it is realized that word or pen cannot heal the wounds of a saddened heart, we know that you will share the glorious attitude of all Americans that no sacrifice is too great for righteousness. Hobart was one of those being brought home on the USS Joseph Connolly in that photograph we saw earlier in October of 1947, and he was buried here in Gettysburg, November 22nd of that year. These are some of the Adams County native sons who fought and died in World War II. And it should be noted that not all of Adams County's native sons did come home. Some are still buried overseas. The American Battle Monuments Commission maintains cemeteries all over the globe, providing a fitting resting place for American soldiers and servicemen who gave their lives for their country. These cemeteries, for just the World Wars alone, commemorate over 207,000 Americans. For World War I, the American Battle Monuments Commission maintains cemeteries where over 31,000 Americans are buried and over 4,000 more who were missing in action are memorialized. And for World War II, the ABMC cemeteries are the final resting place of 93,000 Americans, where 79,000 more are memorialized. General Mark Clark, prominent American general in World War II, he went on to say this: "If ever proof were needed that we fought for a cause and not for conquest, it could be found in these cemeteries. Here was our only conquest. All we asked was enough soil in which to bury our gallant dead." He was the ABMC chairman for a while, from 1969 to 1984. One of his predecessors was George C. Marshall, who wrote in a 1957 National Geographic article, "In creating these cemeteries, quote, we were keeping faith with the fallen and taking to them all that we could of home, of beauty, and of remembrance." There is it again, that idea of home, taking to them that idea of home, even those who are buried overseas. Marshall wrote also, "With all my heart, I believe that no one who left a son overseas should doubt the fittingness of his final resting place, that he should have for a time unending a part of the ground he so dearly bought is supremely right and fitting." He described these fallen as the sons of every free man. This photograph here is of Normandy American Cemetery. Well, just to note two stories of Adams County native sons who are buried overseas. Lester Weinbrenner, native of Fairfield, he was a tinner and a farmer before he joined up in April of 1942. He served in the 6th Armored Division, which was under the command of General, some of you may have heard of, George Patton. He was a private first class, fought in Normandy in northern France, and then he fought in the Battle of the Bulge, where he was listed as missing in action. He was captured by the Germans on January 4th of 1945. And Lester died in a German prisoner of war camp, March 23rd of 1945. Word was received back home because of a medical officer, an American Red Cross medical officer who was in the camp as well, who was able to pass word of Lester's death to his family. Today, Lester is still buried overseas. He's buried in the Lorraine American Cemetery in Saint-Avold, France, the largest American cemetery in Europe. These photographs are courtesy of the superintendent of the Lorraine American Cemetery, who sent them specifically for us and for this program. Lester does also have a memorial marker at a family plot in St. Joseph Cemetery in Emmitsburg. And we also have to talk about Horace Bushman, Corporal Horace Bushman, a native of Gettysburg, born in August of 1916 to Rufus and Hattie Bushman. His mother died when he was 5. He had varied interests, lots of community involvement. He was really an all-American kid. Went to Gettysburg High School, played varsity football, basketball, and baseball, graduated in 1935. He worked as a pressman for the Gettysburg Times, so he no doubt knew Maurice Small and his family. Was a member of the Gettysburg Fire Company. He was married. His wife was named Marion, married in March of 1942. And Horace was drafted into the Army on October 19th of 1942. He became a member of Battery A of the 310th Field Artillery Battalion, 79th Infantry Division. They went overseas in March of 1944, sailing on the RMS Queen Mary. They arrived in France on Utah Beach on June 14th, just days after the invasion. On June 19th, Horace's Field Artillery Battery fired their howitzers for the first time, and just days later, when Horace was driving in a Jeep near an observation post, a German shell struck a nearby tree, killing him instantly. The unit's history recorded Horace's death with the words, it, quote, hit the battery pretty hard, and the men's spirits were low that night. Horace was 27 years old when he died. When news arrived of his death here in his hometown of Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Times put it on the front page. Horace is still buried overseas in Normandy, at the Normandy American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, St. Laurent-on-the-Sea, overlooking the bluffs and sands of Omaha Beach. Plot E, row 24, grave 28. On August 29th, over 250 people gathered at the Gettysburg Presbyterian Church, the same one Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower would one day call their own, for a service to honor Horace, putting his name in gold on the church's honor roll. In the remarks that day given by Reverend Robert Hunt, he said, Horace Bushman gave his life for you and for a world of free men in service of God and country. And he went on to say this. I should note, by the way, those photographs of Horace's grave are courtesy of the superintendent of the Normandy American Cemetery. Horace Bushman, together with a great many comrades, went forth in a great crusade and pledged his life to liberate the enslaved, to overcome the world of force and oppression, in order that men might once more live in freedom upon the earth. He was victorious in this crusade, for by the grace of God he saw men and women and little children freed from the tyrant's yoke. He helped drive fear from the faces of people like ourselves, and to see it replaced with joy, confidence, and a new hope. There's some tinges of the Gettysburg Address in there, I think. Some similar themes. And notice the use of crusade, same word Eisenhower used to describe the campaigns in Europe. Horace was not brought home, but his remains still rest in Normandy, along with thousands and thousands of his brothers. In the movie Saving Private Ryan, when they finally find Private Ryan, the correct Private Ryan, and they tell him that his brothers had passed, and they give him, basically say, we're here to take you home. Private Ryan tells Captain Miller, portrayed by Tom Hanks and Matt Damon, Private Ryan tells Captain Miller that he's not going. And Captain Miller responds, well, what are we supposed to tell your mother when we hand her another American flag? He says, tell her that I stayed with the only brothers I had left. And that word always reminds me of the Normandy Cemetery. All the graves, by the way, in the Normandy American Cemetery are facing west. They're facing home. So in reflecting on these stories, I think we've explored the idea of what makes a place home. All of these individuals were either born here or lived here at one point. The one thing they all have in common is that Gettysburg was an important part of their lives. It was a defining part of their lives. Again, they grew up in the shadow of Lincoln's great task and then went and fought and gave their lives in pursuit. And alongside this great crusade, which General Eisenhower described. And this came at a great cost, felt by the families. The names of these parents and widows and children that we've heard here today, they are the ones who also bore this cost of these individuals who gave their lives. And this idea of home, it's such a powerful unifying and motivating factor. Whether it's a member of the 69th or 72nd Pennsylvania fighting on Cemetery Ridge and July 3rd of 1863 defending their home soil, or whether it's one of these individuals who we've heard about and met here today, serving in World War II for the purpose of the idea of maybe someday coming home and expanding freedom, preserving freedom in the world, and at the same time protecting their home. It's such a universal concept that we can all understand and identify. For Lester Weinbrenner and Horace Bushman, home is where they are buried with the only brothers they had left. For many others, home was the person to go home to, and having that opportunity to have their body brought home was so meaningful for so many. And it certainly was meaningful for Mrs. Thelma Jeffries, who was the sister of Lowell Clark. Lowell Clark also was not born here in Gettysburg. He was born in Indiana, but his family moved here in the 1930s. His parents passed away when he was 13. So Lowell's older sister, Thelma, she raised him. She was 6 years older. She was 19, he was 13. She oversaw the rest of his adolescence. And even after Lowell was married, he and his wife still spent time with Thelma, and when he went overseas, his wife was living with Thelma because she was pregnant. Their son, Thomas Francis Clark, was born May 18th of 1944. His wife was Anna. Lowell joined up in 1942. He served in the 3rd Armored Division. He went overseas in the summer of 1944, the same summer that his son was born. He never had a chance to meet his son, Thomas Francis Clark. And Lowell was killed in action on October 3rd of 1944 at the age of 27. This is Lowell's junior high class photo from Indianapolis, Indiana. And Lowell was ultimately, of course, brought home, buried here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He's the last of our Adams County natives we are meeting here today. He was buried on December 15th of 1947. And for several years, on the anniversary of Lowell's death, his sister Thelma would publish poems on the anniversary in the local papers. And these are just 2 of them. From October 3rd of 1946, he went one day with a cheery wave, a gay farewell and a smile he gave. And he went with a purpose true, in the window was hung a star of blue. He did the task that was given him to help rid the world of greed and sin. He fought a good fight, so the message told, but the star of blue has turned to gold. Dear Father, be near those homes we pray, where the message has come or will someday. Comfort each heart with the love so true, where a gold star hangs in place of blue. For each of these individuals, home was Adams County, and it meant something very significant to them. Something so significant that they were willing to give their lives, partly for it, partly for the country that they called home, but also for Adams County. Think about what home means to us and what we would be willing to do for it today. On October 3rd of 1947, Thelma published this poem. When the evening shadows fall and we are sitting all alone, in my heart there comes a longing if you could come home. Oft and oft my thoughts do wander to your grave so far away, where they laid you, dearest brother, 3 years ago today. 2 months later, Lowell Clark, who was born in Indiana, who lived and worked in Littlestown, Pennsylvania, and who fought and died in Germany, was brought home and buried in Gettysburg National Cemetery on December 15th of 1947. A man who had lived in so many places was finally home. Thank you all so much for coming here today and for joining us for our lecture. Very much appreciated.